Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's probably one of our final webinars in the Classics and Archaeology Festival here. And we saved the best for last here with Professor Jeremy Hartnett of Wabash University in Indiana. And he's the author of the very popular The Roman Street. And he's here to discuss some of the aspects of non-elite Roman lives, including in religion, death, sexuality, and philosophy. So he's going to show us some slides as well. And I'll just let you know, there's a Q&A afterwards. Please put your questions in. And once he's done, we'll most likely answer everything that's possible, all the questions. So here we go with Mr. Professor Hartnett. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joyce, for the invitation, also for CUP, for publishing the first book and for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to share my screen here and tell you a little bit about my goals today as I'm talking. My first book with CUP was dedicated to the Roman Street, as Joyce said, and I was thinking about this as a social space and its dynamics. I think that among the most successful chapters were those that didn't sort of generalize and paint in broad brushstrokes, but instead the ones that presented case studies of particular corners. And this got me thinking about the challenges of bringing that sensibility to social history, not of a space, but to individuals, especially those beyond the elite folks whose voices, despite my best intentions in the classroom and scholarly inclinations, can still largely dominate. So usually when I'm teaching a Roman history or Roman social history class, I end up using source books, which largely bring together upper crust voices drawn from different times and places, and they leave students to do a lot of the meaning making themselves. And they also bypass some of our best evidence for the lower rungs of society, namely material culture. There are, of course, abundant and excellent narrative treatments of Roman social history. But if I had a couple critiques of those, or things that I find a little unsatisfying, they'd be first, that those things tend to segment life artificially: work, sex, leisure, etc. Each one gets their own chapter or treatment, when in reality, those things were all tied up with one another when we think about individuals' lives. Secondly, those books oftentimes adduce the same examples of phenomena. I mean, how many times have I in a classroom shown the Friedman Relief from the British Museum with the moneyer and the carpenter? So all that gets me to my current book project, which I'm not claiming threads the needle, but offers something of a different approach. Instead of starting with a broad topic and dropping into specific examples, it reverses this funnel and concentrates on one figure and seeks to consider his life and death in as much detail as possible, tracing out his different parts of his life across multiple areas. In other words, it turns that funnel into a pyramid. This guy is named Flavius Agricola, and we know about his life not from literary or historical sources, but instead from the surviving evidence of his tomb, a life-size portrait, and his epitaph. Because the book project is going to trace topics brought up by this funerary assemblage, it can't claim to be an encyclopedic treatment of Roman life and death, but it does delve into topics ranging, as Joyce said, from religion and philosophy to sex, gender, leisure, hierarchy, foodways, demography, death, and others. So my goal isn't so much to break new ground, but to tell an interesting story, to give a specific narrative that appeals to general readers as well as to students who have a little background in Roman history, but really yearn for more depth and nuance. So what I'm going to do is to introduce this monument, discuss some of the questions it raises for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then give a brief overview of its fascinating afterlife when it passed through the hands and before the eyes of popes, cardinals, falling Ancien Regime houses, notorious Parisian art dealers, mustache-twisting American industrialists, and leading New York antiquities dealers before it ultimately landed here in Indiana at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. So enough preliminaries, let me dive in. The year was 1626, and digging began for Bernini's famous baldacchino over the high altar in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. When the workers started digging down for the southeast corner for a foundation, they struck through the Renaissance floor of the church, went down through some crypt, down through the Constantinian floor, and ultimately landed on a Roman imperial era necropolis. That's digging back through time. Let's move forward through time instead. Why was this here in the first place? Here on the Vatican Plain in the northwest part of Rome, was the Circus of Gaius and Nero, the notorious spot where St. Peter was martyred. His remains were taken and buried in a fairly humble tomb labeled Area P here, the Campo P right here. And ultimately, they were joined by a series of other tombs, as well as commemorations of similarly humble folk like Peter. Now, this necropolis grew up on the north side of the Circus of Gaius and Nero until Constantine came along, wanted to then build the entire Constantinian Old St. Peter's, as we call it, over the tomb of Peter, and then had the tops lopped off of these tombs and used them essentially as an earth retaining wall, and therefore buried these, preserving them very well. Now, in 1626, when this sculpture and its epitaph came out of the ground, it caused an immediate lockdown of the dig site. That's largely because of its last four lines. You can see these didn't exactly chime with papal sensibilities, since they encourage readers to take part in wine, women, and whoopee. This is a ground zero. In fact, one of the major ground zeros for Christendom, and this guy shows up. What happened in the aftermath then was, as you can see from a nearly contemporaneous document, that the verses were plastered and filled with gesso, and the statue was carried off. Even some people said it was launched into the Tiber River in order to eliminate this thing from memory. Nevertheless, before the inscription could be destroyed, antiquarians, 17th century antiquarians, under cover of night, in the inky shadows, descended into the foundation and transcribed the inscription, and that's the reason we have it. I want to look at the sculpture and inscription in turn. So this is a life-sized marble sculpture of a figure reclining at banquet on a fancy couch, and he's cradling a cup in his left hand. You can see his right hand raised to his head, and you might even also make out that there are several places where there are holes in his head for the insertion of a crown. There's also a cutting in the lower part down by his feet, and this most likely was for his cinerary urn. If it looked something like this, it would offer a visual pendant to the cup, maybe a contrast between wine and death. Though the inscription is lost, we have a sense of where it might have been, thanks to a 17th century drawing of this sculpture. When it was taken away from the Vatican and reached its next destination. I'll return to that in a bit. The inscription was occupied this lowest part of the funerary monument. The inscription gives our figure's name, Flavius Agricola, and gives us some idea of what he might have been. That is, he probably wasn't a farmer, but instead Agricola is probably his cognomen, and since his nomen is Flavius, this links him most likely to the Flavian dynasty. Now, we suspect, based on the sculptural typology, that he lived around, this monument was constructed around 160 CE. So he's unlikely to have been a freedman of the Flavian dynasty, but he may well have been only a generation or two removed from a freedman. He clearly had remarkable resources to afford this, which reminds us of the intense social mobility that some people enjoyed in the imperial period. Now, his epitaph is 15 verse lines, and they divide into three pretty clear sections. In the first part, Flavius introduces himself, gives his origin, and really draws your eye to who he is. I'm the very one reclining as you see me. I took care of my little soul, and the wine was never lacking. In the second part, we learn about his wife, Flavia Primitiva, and get a miniature biography of her. She's identified as a worshiper of Isis. She comes in for a bunch of sort of stock descriptors of matronly females. And then we also learn about her son, who may not have been also Flavius's son. And then we learn about the fact that she predeceased Flavius and took care for his future. And then the last part of the inscription admonishes readers, giving them instructions to basically do what Flavius is shown doing, mixing wine, drinking deep, wreathing his head with flowers. The one part of the admonition that's not shown is the sexy times that he's supposed to have been enjoying, or at least that he encourages his readers to enjoy. And then we get a final semi-philosophical closing. What's fascinating is the first and the third parts really hold together. Then the first and the second person, largely in the present tense. And then the middle section, we get the third person and the past tense. There's really an emphasis, as I noted, on the act of seeing and reading. It's me, Flavius, who's doing what just as I did in my life. And as we said, the admonition is almost a caption for the sculpture. So we get to see a sense of this as a careful attention to a unified ensemble. We can even pinpoint where this guy was buried. He was buried in Tomb S. We can't actually look at most of the tomb today because it's occupied, of course, by the foundation for Bernini's Baldacchino. That is, the workers, the Sampietrini in the 17th century, dug this hole, they extracted Flavius's monument, and then they refilled it to support the gigantic Baroque monument on top. However, we can see that this isn't a normally shaped foundation, but instead there's a little abnormality in the northwest part of this, and that's because that's where Flavius's monument nestled underneath an arcosolium. Now, subsequent years have seen more excavation through the 40s and afterwards. And as many of you know, you can visit this now and get about 70 meters of this imperial necropolis. So if we sort of take stock of this, we can see, we touch on we have a remarkable ensemble of evidence and something for everyone. A sculpture with portrait. We've got him partaking in a cultural practice. We've got a Latin verse epitaph, a semi-philosophical end. We've got a fine spot within a tomb, within a necropolis, within a city. And we've got that rich context. We can examine its decoration and also its architecture. So this gives me lots of potential approaches or topics or questions. We might ask, for example, why does Flavius commission a poetic epitaph? Why does he draw on or sample poets such as Horace? Here you can see he pays homage to another famous native of Tibur, of Tivoli, a guy named Plancus, whose tomb you can also visit in Gaeta, by the way, and has several of the same sentiments pick up. This is also draws on parallels from Ovid and Hadrian as well. So why does he sample these folks? Why does he even show himself dining or at least drinking? What are the notions of the body where we get this um, this old, wizened head and this youthful, gymmed out body. Why, for Romans, are dining and death and philosophizing so linked together? What sort of image emerges of Flavia Primitiva in the 7 lines that are given to her? What does it mean for her to be identified as a chaste cultress of the Pharian goddess? And how are we to reconcile that with uh, Flavius's imprecation to enjoy bedroom activities? How was Flavius remembered and celebrated by his survivors? What sort of eating and drinking might have taken place around this tomb? On what kind of occasions? And what impact did that have on visitors? And last, how might Flavius have toyed with the distinction between life and death? We think of this as a hard and fast divide, but when he's speaking through the inscription or participating in the very act that some of his visitors to the tomb might have been also doing, how does this play with the slippage between life and death? So these are just a few of the questions I think this monument raises, and I welcome the suggestions of participants for others that occur to them. Rarely are there sort of simple answers, but one of my goals in this book is to actually revel in the complexities of an individual's of life, not pretending that everything was neatly resolved, but instead thinking about some of the tension spots. The other goal I have for this book is to give students a sense of how we know what we know about the ancient world, how it gets to us, and what meanings have been invested in it over time. And to that end, archival work has allowed me to piece together the remarkable travels that Flavius Agricola monument has endured. So the last part of the book is sort of an object biography that I hope might read for our students and for interested readers as a sort of episodic podcast, and that grants a deeper sense, not just the history of the object, but the history of its interpretation and the interconnection between the two. So despite the fact that some people rumored that this piece was chucked into the Tiber, it shows up elsewhere, a less polemical source than that original one. In fact, the guy who commissioned the 17th century drawing says that it was moved across Rome to the garden of the Cardinal Barberini, which eventually became the Palazzo Barberini. And we can even identify where it was in the Palazzo Barberini and the other artworks that shared its room. Here's an inventory of the Palazzo Barberini, and here's a sense of the other things that were in that spot. You could see that it, in some ways, was part of a Uomini Famosi cycle that was popular from the Renaissance into the Baroque, and it helped to tell some of the Barberini tale. Now, the Barberini family melded with another. They ended up dividing the state, and this piece went off to the Palazzo Sciarra. And by the late 19th century, as grand houses across Europe started to fail, the artworks got sold off, often provoking controversy. People raised an outcry that the Sciarra Colonna family were selling Italian national cultural heritage, even though Italy had been only a country for less than a generation, a little more than a generation. We know that it went on to the art market, probably in the late 19th or early 20th century. And then by 1936, we know that a notorious Parisian art dealer owned it. He's shown here in a portrait by Matisse. His name's Georges Joseph Damat. His Parisian atelier was renowned for improving artworks. The famous and notorious Parthenay kings at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is an example. Their tops are authentic, but their legs are forgeries. And we can see that before and after Flavius Agricola went through Damat's atelier, we can see that he underwent some changes. The struts, for example, being carved away, and a number of restorations being made. I'll point out the fingers on the cup and also the fingers on his head, in addition to the removal of the struts. This is a reminder of one of de Motte's great rivals, Sir Joseph Duveen, said. Europe has a great deal of art and Americans have a great deal of money. So it's not surprising that this thing made its way to New York, both to cater to that interest and also around a time when Nazi Germany was on the rise. We know that this thing was set up in some 57th Street galleries and shown to industrialists with names on institutions that we know, Carnegie, Roosevelt, Getty, Hearst, but it didn't sell until an auction in 1949. And what I'm showing you on the bottom right is actually a catalog from the Met in New York with handwriting that shows who it sold to, French and Company. And that brings us to an interesting place that this shows up, namely in the November 10th, 1957 New York Times. An advertisement for French and Company as part of a heroic bargain basement sale. And this guy gets a remake at this time. He's called Lucullus, the noted bon vivant of the late Republic, who was renowned for dining in style. They can do this because the inscription and the sculpture hadn't been relinked by scholars by this time. Well, the other thing that's fascinating about this portrayal of him is the way that it sort of personalizes these pleasures that Flavius / Lucullus are enjoying. And it shifts the frame from the sculpture's content to its physical form and its potential for a buyer. Like Lucullus, the potential purchaser will have fancy outdoor spots, resplendent food and drink, and a spot to take a dip like a screen idol. We get nothing about its historical value, beauty, etc. It's just simultaneously classy and fun. So stripped of its context and appearing as nothing but content, the statue gets a new identity that seizes on its posture and activity. We can see some of the intended audience when we pan out, since a menagerie of ads appeared on the page and they shout its presumed readership. Not just ads for brassieres and hair coloring removal, but it's shoehorned among engagement and marriage announcements. This is page 108, and this same pattern runs from page 89 to 123 of this Sunday New York Times. The target audience, it would seem, is female, wealthy, and interested in the latest social happenings. Or, as French and Company's patriarch Mitchell Samuels put it, we wanted to reach the increasing number of Americans with constantly improving tastes and the money with which to indulge them. So not just about women, but the burgeoning post-war upper middle class and increased buying power of women in particular. So what are the lessons of the afterlife? We can see this thing cast along on waves of history: rise of Christianity, the early modern obsession with ancient stuff, the decline of the old aristocratic order, the rise of the nation state, World War II, the importance of American industrialists, and the changing social and economic dynamics in the United States. As an archaeologist, I tend to think about the bookends, where something was found and its current display. But that kind of bookending ignores the middle parts, which obviously could lend their own meaning to this piece, whether it was a Baroque trophy, a token of national heritage, or a sign of refinement. And all those different middles could physically alter the piece, removing the inscription, chopping off the bottom part, cleaning up parts, ditching the struts. And each of these interventions, I hope that you can see, had knock-on effects for the next phase of its life. So this, I hope, will raise the question for readers about what meanings we're investing in this piece that are products of our own time and place. This kind of process of selectively altering the past and then thinking about it in our own terms is more concrete for something like sculpture. But what about for the history of ideas, like ordinary Romans, who for so long we've referred to as the non-elite, which is accurate, but not really descriptive, since it kind of lumps everyone in together. So at this point, I'm happy to take some questions from Joyce or from the the people in the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jeremy. Right now, we're still waiting for some questions, but right now I have one. How do you go about researching the Roman lower class societies?
Yeah, I feel as though I'm working from tracing one like ephemeral phenomenon in like Roman street life, which you can't obviously like look at directly, and now moving on to another one where we're trying to piece together an individual's life, where we have even here with this remarkable amount of evidence, still we're sort of picking here and there. So let me like address those two things in order. The first thing I would say is that we obviously, for the lower Roman classes, don't have much immediate testimony by them. We have graffiti, funerary epitaphs, but we also do have what they built, inhabited, etc. And so that gets to the point of like the importance of material culture, but that nevertheless leaves us with plenty of gaps. And so I would say a couple of different things there. I would say, first of all, sometimes those gaps can be filled, or we can at least be more aware of them if we look at comparative evidence from other times and places. We don't want to look necessarily for a direct analogical approach. This is the way it was in Rome, and this is the way it was in Renaissance Florence, and this maps cleanly onto this. But instead, we can sometimes see a number of possibilities, consider some questions that wouldn't be obvious to us, and get a little bit, or maybe on occasion, draw out some common patterns. If we limit ourselves to the ancient Roman evidence, where we're trying to think about individuals' embodied lives in the Roman lower classes, it is a lot harder to get at those. I mean, as I said, we can sometimes think about epigraphs, we could think about inscriptions, housing, but a lot of times we have to like piece those things together and view them in the conglomerate, and then sort of trace broad contours of life. Now, the problem with that is that we're always like looking at the Roman world from 1,000 feet or 10,000 feet, when I'm much more satisfied by looking like face to face, or trying to like move the narrative camera down from this like statistical high point and instead take it into the street, or trying to look at Flavius through the eyes, or look through Flavius's eyes. And unfortunately, we're like limited to his version of his life, of like a curated highlight reel. Now that's good and bad. I mean, it's bad in the sense that we don't have the place where he lived. Sure, we can go see where we can think about what Flavia Primitiva's life was like as a worshiper of Isis, but we can't really get at a lot of what he does. But nevertheless, the sort of ideology that he espouses, the way that he presents himself, can nevertheless be revealing. And I'm resistant to trying to like take. All right, I'm dealing with attention and trying to piece out his individual experience. On the one hand, when I don't have something for him, I have to look a little more broadly and survey some of the broader context. But if I presume that he acts just like everybody else, then that undermines the whole project of thinking about an individual's life, because we have to make room for someone to be unusual, for things to not map cleanly, for some people to not fit the pattern. So there's something of a balancing act in that, and I'd welcome people's comments and questions along those lines, or suggestions along those lines.
Great. Okay, we have one coming up from Molly Sweetnam Berland. She says it's a great talk. She said she'd like to hear more about the climb. Do you think this is intended to read as an elite symbol?
Yeah, the cleaner, the couch there is definitely, it's part of a fuller apparatus of status. I mean, like, this guy is on an elegant piece of furniture. He is lounging on a really nice and cushy cushion. It's clear from the decoration it's supposed to be like lathe turned legs. So this isn't just any old couch, but it's part of a broader sense of dining. And I guess to get to Molly's question, I think we could think about the way that this guy is showing himself really at leisure. All right, I'm going to do a vast oversimplification, but we tend to think, all right, lowest of the low, we have to be probably had to be satisfied with funerary accommodations that were a little more than being, buried or being cremated and having the neck of an amphora over their remains. And then when we go way up to the top, we tend to think of the sort of senatorial class listing the offices that they held, the various ways that they prevailed, but according to the sort of scoreboard of senatorial class life. And the question is, like, what happens between those two? And people like Eve Dombra and Sandra Joshua have, pointed out the degree to which freedmen and lower class folk really seize on their labor. A lot of people who are on the call probably are familiar with the funerary monument of the cobbler at the Centrale Monte Martini in Rome, where it's a guy who's shown as a bust, and then in the sort of mini pediment above his head, he shows the shoe lasts that are the identification of his work. Work seems to be a big part. All right, so that's a big lead into to answering Molly's question. Is Flavius Agricola, though probably only a generation or two removed from slavery, doesn't really seize on either of these two things. He really shows himself not in the work of labor or business, but instead shows himself at leisure, right? He's enjoying not just a meal, but a social ritual that very few people could marshal. This is the place where, of course, people are at leisure, but it's also a place where you come into contact with other folks and grease the interlocking wheels of power, wealth, and status in the Roman world. So the other thing I would say is that he's elevating it. He's not just he's probably looking upwards towards an elite lifestyle, but not elite funerary commemoration style. But he's also in some ways sort of pushing down on the folk below him, in the sense that he's saying, I'm not showing my work or my labor or my business, but instead I'm showing myself as and able to enjoy a realm of leisure. So I suspect that's really what he's doing here.
Okay. We have another one from Patrick Tosmeyer. When the monument was discovered, had it been completely buried or was it part of a room-like structure?
Could you repeat that, Joyce, the second half?
Okay. Had it been completely buried or was it part of a room-like structure?
It had been completely buried. A number of these adjacent tombs had their tops leveled off. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of interesting evidence for things like solaria, like a rooftop dining on top of these spots. But this one was entirely buried, and it wasn't the only remains found in this in tomb S. We know that underneath the arcosolium in the back was Flavius Agricola. There was a terracotta sarcophagus on the west side, and there was places for a couple of cinerary urns as well. There was a mosaic a simple mosaic in the middle, and also marble all the way around the outside with a series of holes in it, so that the people whose ashes were below the floor of the tomb could be could have wine poured out to them. Now, that said, it was found whole, but we can't view all of it whole because of the damage done by the 17th century excavators, the workers who were digging the foundations. So the piece of evidence that I would love to have, but we don't have, is probably an inscription that would have been above the door of the tomb. If it's anything like the one its neighbors, it would have had that. And it may have been something like what is on Flavius's monument, or it might have been something entirely different. But unfortunately, it was never recorded, if it was there.
Okay, next up we have Glennis Davis. Could the cutting at the feet have held a portrait bust of the wife rather than the urn? There are parallels for reclining figures holding a bust of their spouse.
That's a really good question, and I want to say thanks to Glennis for her excellent work on this piece. She's one of the few scholars who's really dug into it very much. Yeah, that's true. There are busts on other Cline monuments that seem to be that seem to be part and parcel of it. They don't necessarily seem like they were inserted into it, and usually when they're part of it, the deceased who's shown reclining is often like has his or her arm around it in some sort of embrace. So I have to admit we don't know for sure, but our closest parallels suggest that that if it was a bust, it probably would have been closer up to Flavius's torso and would have had a little more engagement with him. And we do know that there were cinerate urns or just places for ash embedded in some of these Cline monuments. In fact, there's a really nice one that shows, this is in the Terme Museum in Rome for people who are familiar with it. It shows the deceased man holding a bust of his wife. And then right up behind his shoulder was a place for her ashes. And we know that because there was a lid on top that was inscribed saying it was the bones of his deceased wife. So it's a possibility. I also really like the idea, given how playful this whole thing is and how connected the sculpture, as Glennis has shown, the sculpture is to the epitaph, that it may have been a cinerate urn, or it could have even been one that was in the shape of a crater that gave some visual cue to the like wine mixing that's part of the epitaph. But the truth is, this is all speculation.
Okay, great. We have one from Danielle Lalonde. She says, "Thank you for this fascinating talk. What can you conjecture about Flavius's life or his wife's life so far?"
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me talk about his wife, because in some ways we get a couple of diagnostic clues, even in the little bit that she's described as a chaste cultress of the Pharian goddess, who is Isis. We have very few parallels for women being called a cultrix in the cult of Isis, or anything that's really before adherence to the Christian God. So, but the emphasis on chastity may have several different sort of valences of meaning. One is that Isis worshippers, and especially the Temple of Isis in Rome, was sort of a renowned pickup spot. You don't have to go very far beyond Juvenal to see suspicions about female sexuality that are related to the Temple of Isis. But also, we know that worshippers of Isis observed periods of abstinence, sexual abstinence, and also, in terms of some types of sustenance. And this was, we get this evidence from folks, even like love poets, who bemoan the fact that their lady friends are worshiping Isis for these 10 days, so they don't get to enjoy bedtime with them. And this would suggest that the cultrix suggests a degree of adherence to the goddess, and also the chastity isn't strict chastity. I mean, she's not virginal, but I mean, after all, she has a child. But instead, it is a general idea that she is holy, and also an adherent to the cult, who's serious about this and who follows the precepts. In terms of their life, however, it's harder to get a good sense of what Flavius or Flavia did on a daily basis. We can piece together some of the space that Flavia would have inhabited when she went to the Temple of Isis. There are sculptures and obelisks all over Rome, marble foot in the Campus Martius from that monument. And we know about the monument's plan both from literary sources and also from the marble plan of Rome. But beyond that, we're quite limited to what Flavius tells us about them in death, which unfortunately is somewhat limited.
Okay. Oh, we have one here from Richard Fisher. He says, thank you. So how do you think Flavius afforded such a large marble monument to himself? Any speculation on profession, social circle, relations to aristocrats, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to go for speculation here. There are people who have said, well, maybe Agricola, he maybe was a farmer or something, but we don't really see many anything like that. It's possible that if he were, we know that imperial freedmen, the former slaves of emperors, emerged from their servitude with I was going to say a Rolodex of connections, but that's kind of an anachronism now, with a contact list of connections and skills that oftentimes could launch them up the social hierarchy. So it is possible that if, as I suspect, Flavius was a descendant of an imperial freedman, that he may have gotten some of the wealth that way. Other than that, this is one of those frustrating parts where we don't have enough evidence to really pick at this. We've got his portrait. He's like the Instagram poster who only shows himself on yachts or at Ibiza or in Vegas, drinking, who doesn't show the hours, laboring over a keyboard or doing something else. We just don't have. Flavius chose not to tell us much about those things, which, as I said, it may be a way for him to have a foot up on some of the folks who did link their commemoration in death to their work in life.
We have one here from Steve Walton. How can we identify the social location of a man like this? He sounds relatively well off from what you have said, but I think that was kind of answered in your previous question, but about his status. But if you have anything further to say.
Well, I think one of the things we can do is just look at. It's hard for us to say what exactly his status was, but we can compare him to some other people who were commemorated in this necropolis. His is not one of the largest tombs. In fact, it's one of the smaller ones, although it does present a facade that's nearly the same width as some of the other ones. And those other tombs have room for as many as 170 members of a household to be either interred or have their ashes kept there. So, when you build something like that, you're building it for future generations. You're giving a sense of, that's an index of what you expect to be your household size in the years to come. And so you don't want to have, you want to have a domus frequentata, a house that's full of visitors. You don't want to have a big tomb that ends up being full of only a smattering of different people who get interred or their ashes put there. So Flavius's tomb, it offers some index of that, and it's more on the scope of a couple of dozen spots rather than the 170. And one of those tombs that was nearby had room for 170 and ended up, some of them had to be double used, and ended up with 230 people being kept there. So that gives us one index. It's clear that Flavius wants to show himself as someone who is learned and cultured, both through his philosophizing and also through his adaptations. The literary epitaph, which is only about 1 or 2% of Latin inscriptions overall, as well as the sort of learned quoting or sampling of other of leading poets.
Okay. We have one from William Owens. He says, "A great talk, Jeremy. Do you have any thoughts on the mixture of cultural practices indicated in the monument, like Roman, Latin, Isaac Colt, Greek philosophers at the symposium.
One of the things that fascinates me about this piece and about Roman life more generally is the sort of triangle among drinking, death, and philosophy. I mean, two-thirds of that triangle aren't surprising to us. I mean, when we tip back our nth cup of wine, we do tend to like get deep, right? And also when we're on death's door, we do end up pondering some of the big questions. But for me, like the fascinating connection is not between, drinking and philosophy or death and philosophy, but it's instead between drinking and death. The fact that the Romans play this up time and again. If people who've tuned in who have read Petronius's Satyricon know that during Trimalchio's dinner party, there's not just the reading of Trimalchio's will and also the description of his tomb, but much earlier in the novel, in the dinner party, there's a place where these silver like marionettes or dolls come out that are skeletons, and people can manipulate them in different ways. Likewise, we see drinking cups with skeletons on them, some of them even labeled as famous philosophers who are saying things like life is a worthless pile of dung. So there's this fascinating connection between those things. But I think to Bill's point, I think all of these parts that Molly touched on, that I discussed earlier, the dining, the philosophizing, and the literary stuff, all adds up to someone who's really yearning and maybe even being successful at portraying himself as someone who's deeply fluent in Roman cultural practices of the elite. Whether that's overcompensating or not is another question.
Okay. We have one here from Emma Arnold. Do you think that he wrote his inscription himself or had someone compose it for him?
Yeah, that's a good question. We know that people did commission poets to pen funerary epitaphs. Courtney's Musa Lapidaria is really good on this question. But that said, like, is it a good poem? Here, let me pull it up again, Joyce, and maybe people can see for themselves. Did Flavius get his money's worth from this poem when he all right, here we go, share screen, and did he get his money's worth? I mean, there are a bunch of different ways we could think about this. If we were to be critical of him, we'd see like the poet's constant reliance on alliteration, for example, through praecesitque prior primitiva, and there's a lot of connective tissue that's shown throughout the whole thing. But that said, we do, as I said, see some learned quotations, sampling of elite authors. So I suspect that Flavius did commission the whole piece as a whole, and because of the careful connection among the tomb, the sculpture, and the epitaph. Whether he had a hand in the specific epitaph, I think that's still an open question. Common practice would have him commission a poet for that.
Is the triad drinking, philosophizing, death a combination of memento mori and carpe diem? That, of course, self-representations in Roman.
And I think one of the fascinating parts about Flavius's portrayal is he's not just he's not just sort of saying, live it up while you can, but he's showing himself doing it as well. There's a fairly well-known epitaph that is also poetic, and it's clearly written by the survivors to the deceased, and they show the deceased in a relief, uh, in a pose much like Flavius's, where he's cradling a cup, he's reclining, he's on a clean, etc. They say like, here, finally you're doing this, but you were such a penny pinching ogre during life, and all you did was you didn't live it up at all, but finally we're showing you like this. And so the idea is like, this guy can sort of enjoy these things in the afterlife that he wasn't able to enjoy then. So it's, for Flavius, it's not just like a do as I say, but by showing himself doing these things. And also, if we think about people coming to the tomb for regular banquets, perhaps even participating, he's life-sized. If his epitaph was read aloud, it would give voice to his words in the first person. Maybe he's toying with the relationship between life and death, and sort of saying not just like do as I say, but do as I did. And it's not just to remember that you'll die, but it's like he's in some ways continuing to participate even after his death.
Okay, it looks like the end of our questions. Any further thoughts on your upcoming project, or any research that we all should be looking forward to in the future?
Well, I just I'd say I came across this partly because it's in Indianapolis, 45-minute drive from my campus, but also because I used it twice as the centerpiece for our classic senior seminar at Wabash, which is always a challenge, I think, for undergraduate programs to design a class like this, because some students are really word nerds. Some students love archaeology, some love history, some are drawn to classics because of ancient philosophy, and so it can be hard to satisfy all of them in a seminar, and not just have it either force them all into one topic or have the seminar atomized into a bunch of independent studies. So what we did for this seminar was study this piece and learned about it collectively for the first third or so of the seminar, and walked all the way around it, and then had students write their papers about some aspect of this piece that interested them. So it allowed us to have sort of the piece was a sort of centripetal force in the seminar that made it coherent, yet it allowed students to entertain their own interests. And then in this middle third and the last third of the semester, we worked up proposals and ultimately had a writing workshop where students ended up doing original research on some aspect of this, and we even rolled it into an alumni event at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. So that's a little plug for not so much for this piece, but for having a specific focus to a seminar that then can accommodate a variety of different interests. And so I need to thank the seminarians in both iterations of the senior seminar at Wabash, and also my students at the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies in Rome, whom I tortured with this only on one occasion for their good thoughts and ideas.
Just want to thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
That's good.